My name is Catherine Liege, and I'm a clinical social worker at the Child Mind Institute. We're a national nonprofit that supports children and families with gold standard mental health care, advice, and resources that is all online and accessible to everyone. We're here for you whenever you need expert telehealth resources, including diagnosis and treatment for mental health and learning disorders, group programs for anxiety, mood disorders, ADHD, and more, and also remote neuropsychological evaluations. Please visit childmind.org/telehealth to learn more. With the protests going on and the violent deaths that continue to occur, uh, many of the children around the nation, around the world, can be feeling scared or confused or angry. We're all thinking about racism and violence and how to raise children that care. We're happy to try to answer any questions that you have about this, as well as parenting challenges and the anxieties you may be facing as well. Today, I'd like to talk about grieving in quarantine and answer your questions on this, as well as anything else you're wondering about. Post your questions in the feed, and we'll also post helpful links, and that will connect you to our online resources at childmind.org. Remember that we're here every day, and we look through your questions daily. Now, I can go ahead and dive into the topic of talking about grieving in quarantine. This is a conversation that's ongoing, and it can stir up a lot of emotions for us. We're not only grieving loved ones and losing them, and just the loss of simple things that we want to do to celebrate our loved ones. But we're also just grieving the normalcy and still grieving today. Just all the changes that are made, things are reopening, things are closing again. So there's just so much going on that brings up a lot of grief, and we're all grieving together. So really the scope that I'm looking at today is going to be more so processing and coping. So when we're thinking about grief and in all of the different ways that we're experiencing it, how we're coping with things, especially because it's probably a more so modified way that you would cope with something, given that you can't go to a funeral anymore. You maybe aren't able to have little ceremonies that would, celebrate your children in school, or, just birthdays, lots of different things that we're missing out on ways to cope, and ways that we are building resilience in each other. So, I have some questions that we got just earlier, and we have some answers for you today. But feel free to jump into the chat. You can ask us anything about grief. Also just the grief and traumatic experiences that we're facing with discussing racism or discussing white supremacy, things like that. I'm happy to answer. But we do have our first question that I will, just start us with. The first one says, I lost my brother shortly before the pandemic. I haven't really had time to grieve. My kids are there, a constant audience, and I am having a harder and harder time keeping it together. I don't know what to do. So this is really what I think is really important here, is to emphasize the use of this constant audience, or you're feeling, I have to, it's being, I'm challenging to keep it together. It's harder to do that. Now, what I think is important to understand is that we shouldn't ignore or try to, suppress our grief. Our kids are going to be an audience, and they will often imitate your own grieving practices. So if they're aware of their uncle passing away, but they can see you just trying to push through, trying not to cry, trying not to show that emotion, they can tend to take that and also do that same thing when they're feeling any sort of grief or sadness and feeling that they need to suppress it, or that they need to keep it together. So don't ignore your grief. Be open about it. If the children do see you crying, why are you crying? You lost your brother before the pandemic, and it's hard because we're constantly hearing more and more about death and dying. We're also just typical things that we are used to do. We're also grieving those. So it's a combination of all of these things, and your children should they're looking at you as their role model, and so you want to be able to say, this is me expressing my emotions. I'm expressing my emotions, and I'm trying to deal with what's going on. So do that, however, you do that, just understanding that feeling sad and okay is just normalize that with your kids so that you can normalize that with yourself. Now, when it comes to reacting explosively or uncontrollably, that teaches your children how to do that as well. So there's a balance here, that it's not going to be perfect. There's not one way to grieve, but just remembering that because they are depending on you to show them how to grieve, that it's important that if there's any unhealthy practices, just knowing when to address those, right? So the processing and the coping, that's really the lens that I want us to look at today, is we're processing, but how are we also coping? So that, I hope that answers some questions that you all may have. If you're just now tuning in, my name is Catherine Liege, and I am a clinical social worker at the Child Mind Institute. Please do put in your questions about grieving during quarantine. I am happy to help, as well as any other questions that you have, your parenting needs. I am happy to answer at this time. We do have another question that I can go through, and I think this is a really good question as far as explaining grief to our children. So, how do I explain death to my child? So he's only 5. So, with this, there's some guidelines to really, I think that would help you really sort of think, okay, how do I want to explain death? Encourage a conversation about what actually happened. So we're trying to avoid those euphemisms like someone passes away or someone, is not here anymore. Those can be really confusing and quite complex for children. So we want to be very straightforward. Death is when someone's not here anymore, and they have gone on, and what maybe is the cause. Maybe it's because of a sickness, or maybe it's because of violence, things like that. We have to really understand how to talk to our children, while also maybe not helping them when they possibly have reactions that are stirring up about that. Because if you talk about violence, if you talk about sicknesses and illnesses, that can really stir up a lot of feelings. So you just want to be there for your child. Encourage them to express their emotions, encourage them to really, just like delve into the truth about this. Even when they're 5, it's just good to cultivate that. It's really hard when we're trying to protect or shelter our children from these truths, right? So if they're attempting to like really feel their emotions or sadness, and you want them to say no, but things get better, it's always good. Really allow them to express that, and talk to them about talk to them about, so I'm thinking of specifically illness. So if we're thinking about illness and we're talking to a 5-year-old about illness, talk to them about how, yes, there are people who die from illnesses. You are very young, so you have it's less likely for you to get sick. Because you are building these, immune systems, and your body is really working hard to make sure you stay healthy. Whereas when you get older, it's, your body tends to not, your body starts to, slow down, and it doesn't allow sicknesses to be fought off as easily. And then, of course, other things that you can say, regarding violence and things like that, is like we're trying to care about each other, and some people don't understand that. So it's our job, right, to start with ourselves, to care about others, and that's how we can really try to, or make sure that we are just not giving into this narrative that violence has to happen, or that it's something that needs to be scary all the time, because the point is, you want to teach your child this is something that has happened, but how does that apply to them right now, right? So we want to be caring, we're very young, and just that reassurance, okay? And that of course will be different, based on age. So kids grieve differently than adults do, of course. So we just want to keep these things in mind: age appropriateness. Just going on about explaining, using language that ensures that they have safety in the moment, right? Like, we're not, there's no violence right here. There's no threats. We are safe in this home right now. We are safe in this conversation. That can really assure them that they're not in any sort of danger, and so that they can regulate their emotions, and you can help them with that and guide them. I will go on to the next question, but again, if you are watching today, thank you, and also feel free to add on any questions you may have about grieving in quarantine at this time, and we're happy to answer them. So I will answer the next question that we have, and this one is about grieving the loss of normalcy. And so I'm grieving the loss of normalcy, the loss of my job. My kids are grieving the loss of the life they've known. It pales in comparison to the loss of a loved one, but it still hurts. What can I do to help my children and myself adjust? So I think this is a great question, and this is actually obviously a fairly common question of how we grieve this normalcy, or the loss of normalcy, especially because we're in this turbulent time where things can reopen, things could shut back down, things can reopen again, and then you see your friends that that state is reopening, this state is not reopening in this type of way. So there's so many things and factors going on here. So acknowledge the grief. I would say that's the number one step, is acknowledge the grief. So, grieving can feel like a quiet process because it requires us to sit in our pain and really understand where our pain is coming from. And so it makes us uncomfortable. And I know a lot of us don't want to feel uncomfortableness. And especially, as kids, and they're looking towards you, sometimes society may even say that being that uncomfortable is unnecessary, right? Or that we shouldn't feel this way or something like that. But we really have to validate our own emotions and acknowledge the grief in order for us to really process it and cope, right? Those two things that I talked about earlier. So it's a quiet process, and sometimes we're just like rushing. We're rushing to get rid of it for feeling grief, and because it's not normalized for some of us. Maybe culturally it's not normalized. Maybe we're, like I said, your kids are looking to you as far as how do I accept these emotions? What do I do with these emotions? They want to be taught by you. And then I would say that secondly, that has to do with your friends, right? When there's teenagers, maybe their other influence is not only you, but their other influences are their friends. And so it goes right back to the parents, right? How are the parents teaching the kids how to grieve, and how are the kids teaching each other how to grieve from what their parents learn? It's all a cycle. And so it starts really with us in our homes and being able to talk to our kids about how to grieve. And so even under normal circumstances, we might be really quick to, like I said earlier, just say, don't be sad. Like, let's go get some ice cream. It's going to be okay. Like, just really thinking of ways to cheer them up in the moment, when really we might be, holding them back from expressing their emotions. So that can be pretty difficult. And so a more helpful response might be, I know how sad this is for you, and it's a really big thing. If you're talking to your child about graduation and not being able to graduate, or maybe your school, the school district your children are in has made a decision, and the decision is that next year will be a fully online or distance learning education, and that could be really heartbreaking for kids. And not only kids, it can be heartbreaking for you, just thinking about what ways you are going to support your family while knowing that next semester, next year, or things like that, next school year, is going to look very different and what that looks like for your work. So I think, we have to say these things like more helpful responses when it comes to our children and say, I know this is really sad for you. I'm feeling a lot about it too. Let's be, I want to admit to you that I'm feeling a lot about this. And I know you miss being with your friends. And I know this is a big loss not to have this. I know it's a big loss, especially for kids or high schoolers that were going off to college. This is a big deal. Validate their experiences, and so validate your own emotions too, and I think that's a big way to adjust. And then secondly, stay in the present. So when we are in this grief, we can often go back in time a lot, and this is quite common. I mean, we start to think about reminiscing, things like that, and there can be some very nice times where we're reminiscing about a loved one that we've had great time with before they passed away, or if you are thinking about, wow, so much fun that I could, so much fun that I had before all of this went down, and what would life look like if this never would have happened. We have to stay in the present. What do things look like right now? Given that, we also can't look into the future and mourn pre we don't I would say pre-mourn. You're basically pre-mourning something. I will be the first one to be honest and say I prematurely mourned a trip that I could not take anymore. So I thought, wow, like this is a family trip that I wanted to have, and I can no longer have this. It makes me really sad. But these are things that this is prematurely. I mean, the date isn't even here yet. I haven't, we're not going on a trip, and so I know that when that date comes and I'm supposed to be on the plane, or my phone is, giving me those reminders or something like that. I know that, I have prematurely grieved that, but that I am accepting what the space that I'm in right now. So not only that, so it's acknowledge your grief and then also staying in the present. But I would say lastly is let people experience grief in their own way. So how we all experience grief and loss can be very different, especially when it comes to your age, but just people in general based on their past and their backgrounds. So if someone is, I want to say, someone uses maybe a coping strategy that is binging Netflix TV shows, right? Could this be unhealthy? I don't know, right? I mean, I think we're trying to cope. We're trying to get our mind on something else, especially if things are all too overwhelming. There is a time where maybe we need to go take that shower, right? Or we need to get something to eat, or get reconnected with our family. But there's a sense of like, let's find some helping or healthy coping strategies in order to really find a balance, I would say. So if maybe you want to binge that TV series, and maybe that'll make you feel good, but also that I'm taking care of my body, I am connected with my friends, and I am being, sharing my emotions and expressing my feelings, just so we're not harboring that. And not addressing that, and especially because we could have a great support team that will help us and support us. I mean, if you are looking for that support team, definitely. I mean, not only can you look within your family, but also, your close friend groups, and then there's professional help. And so we have a lot of resources on our website at childmind.org to really connect you in understanding what exactly you may be looking for especially for your children, and what kind of support can you get. Is the support needed, while you're grieving? Is the support needed for just some extra help with anxiety, with depression, things like that? We want to be able to help. And so there's a time where your support is very strong, maybe in your family life, or maybe it's your friend, your spouse, partner. But we also have to know when we need that support professionally. So those are, three different ways that you can really be able to address how you're feeling. You can be able to address, this loss of normalcy, and those three things: acknowledge the grief, and being able to stay in the present, as well as let people grieve how they want to, but also check in with others, of course. All right, so it looks like we have about 5 minutes left. So I would love to answer any questions that you may have. If you're just now joining, please do add in questions, comments, concerns about, grieving and quarantine. We're happy to help and answer your questions. I have one last question. If anyone, I'll just give a minute. I have one last question that I can address that we received previously, and I can wait here to see if anyone has any questions. But I do appreciate everyone who's watching, especially on a Friday, and you're getting your weekend started, and we're talking about grieving, so I appreciate your time. But we're just wrapping up, and we're happy to answer any questions. But I'll wait just a second, see if anyone has any questions that I can answer before I go on to our last question. I will give you just a couple more minutes. 30 seconds. All right, and if we don't get to them today, no worries. Please do still put your comments into the chat, and then we will get to them at a later date. But I will go ahead and answer our last question, and this question says, my family lost my mother-in-law to COVID. We're unable to have a funeral or say goodbye. My husband is destroyed and barely functioning. My children are confused and keep asking what happened to Grandma. I want to find a way to help us begin to process our grief and help my children understand what happened, but I don't know where to start. So I think this really does go into those two parts of grieving, the loss of a family member, and as well as, grieving the loss of normalcy, like going to funerals. And then we're going to look at this question just in the same lens of processing and coping. So with your children, I think, with the death of grandparents, it can also be maybe their first experience with death. So I think this is really, where you want to go back to an earlier point I mentioned of when you get to a really, an older age, or there are sicknesses, or there are violence happens, really being able to be direct in the language. So, there's a sickness, there's an illness going on, we are, it is spreading across the world, and your grandma, your grandma actually, got this illness, and they had this illness, and they died because of the illness. And this can be a really sad and heart-wrenching thing to tell your kids. So I would say, whoever is closer to them, if it since it's Mom, if you want to take this on, Dad, if Dad is so distraught that he can't, explain what happened, then he's not, it wouldn't be helpful for him to not be the one to tell this information. When your kids are, wanting to, when you're telling your kids, really tough information like this, you have to have some sort of, or it's helpful, I would say, to have a demeanor that can really be received well from the child, because then they will they might also respond in that way. So just being mindful of that, and because they grieve differently, we have to really say, Grandma won't be coming back, but if they have more questions, if they need more time, if they're expressing, start with them there. Don't give too much more information. You don't want to overload them, and so this is what happens when someone dies, and this is, but we believe. Let them grieve, let them, flush out their emotions, and then help them to really get into some coping mechanisms. And crying is okay, right? Crying is okay. But yes, so I hope that that was a helpful answer. Just, how to talk to your children about death and dying as well as grieving. We have great resources online, so please do check those out. We have some great articles that you can see some really good tips. But other than that, I wanted to thank everyone for joining me. I hope this was helpful. We're going to close out for today. Remember that we're here every day to support you during this time. The Child Mind Institute is here to help with mental health and parenting needs during this COVID-19 crisis, no matter where you are. Please visit childmind.org/telehealth to learn more about the incredible variety of remote telehealth resources we have available during this time for children, teens, and young adults. I wish you safety and wellness. Thanks again.